And as always, a very warm welcome to this week's Life Issues. Now, I confess I'm not the biggest fan of statistics, but sometimes they do give you a hint of what might be going on. So here's some that you might be familiar with, and some that might be a surprise. Suicide is the leading cause of death for men under the age of 50. I think we've probably heard that one, haven't we? But did you know that 4 in 10 men have never, ever talked about their mental health or their struggles with their mental health? There's been a 24% increase in mental health referrals in the last 4 years, a trend which is expected to continue to grow. And 40% of churchgoers say that they have experienced poor mental health. And of that 40%, 65, the vast majority of those who have struggled with their mental health have said that the church wasn't supportive. And I suppose that in this day and age, when so many prominent people and so many prominent men have been prepared to talk about and acknowledge their mental health struggles, we might be surprised that there is such a reticence to talk. Except that my own journey to acknowledging my need for help and my justifications for not talking about it along the way, well, they were long, they were varied, and they were complex. And we are very good, especially as men, we are very good about justifying why we won't talk about this sort of stuff. We won't explore it. We'll hold it at arm's length. So this week, Life Issues looks at men's mental health, or more accurately, poor mental health and how it impacts men. Because we all have mental health. It's just sometimes, like my dodgy knee, it doesn't work properly. Bryn Abbott and Paul Marshall are from Mercy UK, and they recently hosted a non-stop 24-hour conversation. Wow, that was some talk on men's mental health. We won't match that, but what is going on that men won't talk about this stuff? Well, Paul and Bryn are with me. And Bryn, it can't always be, well, a bit macho. I don't go to the doctor. I'm a man. I don't want to explore my emotions. It can't be as simple as that, can it?
No, I don't think it is. And I think in some ways that kind of plays into this idea of what is masculinity and what is it to be a man. I think in a lot of ways it's a lot more subtle than that, because you can get men, and I will include myself in this. I would consider myself a fairly sensitive man. I'm quite pastoral by nature. I'm not afraid to talk about feelings. I'm not afraid to be around others that are talking about feelings. And yet I have found myself as a man struggling for exactly the same reasons, where I just don't feel comfortable or don't know how to open up and be vulnerable. So I don't think it is just about the macho, we don't talk about our feelings. I think there is more going on beneath the surface. Statistically, I know you said you don't like statistics at the beginning always, but they do sometimes give us a really helpful indication to what's going on. There was one study that was done that looked into and asked these questions: what are the main reasons that men struggle? And the two of the leading reasons are, I don't wish to be a burden, and I'm too embarrassed. And both of those can often come from actually really well-meaning angles. So if we're a family man, or we've got a position of responsibility, let's say we're a leader within our local church, we can feel like actually we're doing the right thing by not being a burden. And I think for a lot of men, they often find themselves in positions where actually they are the support network for those around them, or they feel like they should be the support network for those around them, for their kids, for their family, for their church world. And so that it's coming from the right place in a way of, I don't wish to be a burden, but ultimately it's misguided. Because what happens is that we keep it inside, we bottle it up, and actually, like a volcano, it will just erupt in unexpected places.
And there is, I think, a sense in which for many men, actually acknowledging that there's a problem, if I don't have to acknowledge it to somebody else, I may feel it, I may struggle with it internally, but if I don't actually have to acknowledge it to somebody else, it kind of holds it at a distance, and it's almost like it's not really happening. We are quite good. I mean, across the board when it comes to medical things, we are quite good, aren't we, at denying the reality and living in denial of something that's maybe making us a little concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reality is that we live in denial, partly because I think the main driver behind all of this is fear. We live in denial partly because we're fearful of what work is going to be expected of us, what level of vulnerability is going to be expected of us if we are honest and if we start that journey of talking about what it is that we're up against. And so the easiest thing to do is just to bury it. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently and thinking, like, we don't want to gender stereotype, do we? We don't want to say men are like this and women are like this, because in some ways that's kind of contributing to the problem. But there is a reality that I find that women find it a lot easier to microdose when it comes to vulnerability. So when they want to connect with other women, when they need to just debrief, when they need time off, they'll often choose connection opportunities that allow them space to talk. So they will meet up with other people. They will talk about their day. If they've had a difficult something difficult happen, their instinct is to pick up the phone and tell somebody, tell their friend, tell their mother, tell their parent. Whereas with men, often when we have that connection time, actually we're choosing to disconnect. We're actually choosing to escape. So we play football, we go to the pub, we go to watch the football with other men, we go out for dinner. But often we're trying to escape from our everyday problems, or we're trying to escape from the stresses of life. We're trying to escape from work. So we're actually making little subconscious decisions not to put ourselves in a position where we're going to have to go deep, because actually we want a little bit of a break from that. We want a break from the expectations and the demands on us. So because we're not in the habit of doing it, to then do it becomes a gigantic task. It feels huge. It feels overwhelming. We know we've got stuff that we need to sort out. But honestly, I think most men, they know deep down they've got some stuff they need to deal with. They know deep down that they're not satisfied with the way that they're living their life. They know deep down that Jesus came so that we can live life and live life to the full. And we know we're not living in that. We know that we are not living life to the full, but we genuinely just don't know how to even make that start and make that first step.
And let me bring you in on this, Paul, because I know part of the work that you do with Mercy, and we should remind people of the website, mercyuk.org, is to work with the Freedom Course and to encourage people to step into that freedom that Bryn's talking about, that God has given us and has available for us. But when we talk about the constraints of poor mental health and its impact on men, what are the sort of key things? What are the key areas where you see it impacting men and the effect that it's having there?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really good question. One of the things are really the general themes of life that all of us as men have, whether we're single or married, but certainly, for example, married men, dealing with issues within marriage, not necessarily that they're in bad marriages, but just the pressure to live up to traditional standards and stereotypes as men, often with provision, financial issues, stress and troubles at work, what it is to be a good father, raising children, and also just that general sense of identity of what is my identity as a man, what is my purpose. And particularly as Christians, you have into the mix of that hugely of how do I be Christ-like and still keep a sense of what has traditionally been shown to me as masculinity. I think, again, with social media and TV and films, the stereotypes of machismo and toxic masculinity that's being taught is a constant challenge as well, because a lot of men have fallen out of the traditional roles that we used to have. And I'm not saying that that's a good or a bad thing, but I do think society has shifted where the men's traditional roles aren't the same and aren't required to be the same as they were, but actually we haven't been taught any different. So that's the kind of thing that comes across is, what is the expectation of me as a man in each of these areas of my life, and how do I respond to that? And how do I feel about it? And I think that one of the big things is, as men, we're often not in touch with how we feel or comfortable with how to express that to other people so that we can learn and adapt and grow as men.
So if it is the sort of core thing that you see again and again is this sense of identity, this need for identity, if that's what is driving with people, what is going on, and is driving those thoughts and feelings, how is that playing out then in the life that is lived, the behaviors that are lived in the light of it?
I think it tends to be, in my experience, that men tend to do one of a few things. Either go to the extreme of pushing that identity by filling it with like macho things and saying, well, this is what a man looks like, so I need to go to the football. But what if I hate football? You know, and actually connecting with authenticity. So the happy ground to be in is to be authentic and to be able to be clear about who you are, what you like, what you believe, and be able to act on that with healthy boundaries and healthy communication. But as I say, then often it will be either go to the extreme of pushing aggressively what it is to be a man in these areas, or actually to do the opposite, which is to completely shrink back and withdraw. And I think we see a lot of that on the course with men in particular, where they're either struggling with aggressive communication because they're trying to communicate what their needs are, but haven't really learned how to do that, or are just saying, well, what's the point? I don't really know myself what's going on with me. I can't explain it to anybody else. So I'll withdraw and kind of lose that sense of responsibility. I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but it seems to be a general theme with men is that it's this flip-flopping between passivity or kind of an aggressive response to whatever it is that's causing me stress.
You're listening to UCB Life Issues. Taking a look this week at the impact of poor mental health in men's lives and acknowledging the fact that so many men really struggle to talk about it, to address it, to even acknowledge that there is a problem. Bryn, Abbott and Paul Marshall are from Mercy UK, mercyuk.org. And you both mentioned there the course that you run, the Freedom Course. And I think historically, Bryn, people would have assumed Mercy UK was about a ministry addressing issues which affect women's mental health and affect the things like eating disorders and so on. So at what point did the change come where you started to recognize you've got a ministry to men as well?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Anyone that has been following Mercy for a while, so we've been running for almost 2 decades now. So there'll be lots of people out there that have known us for certain things in the past. But right from the very beginning, when we opened the residential home almost 20 years ago, it was specifically for young women, so the ages between 18 and 35, roughly. And that was largely a practical thing. So when you're in the residential home, you need to make sure there's similarities between the people that are there. So there was a very practical reason why it was a specific group of people that we were trying to support. But we really quickly as a ministry realized that the process that we take somebody through has relevance to anybody, whatever issue it is that you're dealing with. So right from the very beginning, we've always wanted to find ways to take our experience, our expertise, take the knowledge and the process that we use that we know is really, really effective, and make it available to more people. So we launched a workbook, for example, called Keys to Freedom. We launched that, I can't remember when it was, but it was a long time ago. And that's been on the circuit for a long time. And that's for anybody to work through. Anybody can pick that up and start working through that. And it takes somebody through the same process, the same journey that we use in the residential setting. But like loads of charities, COVID came along and completely disrupted everything. And we had to completely reimagine how we support people. So we were forced to put ourselves in a position of thinking, how can we support people remotely where they don't have to be here on site? So that was a really helpful process, actually, because what we realized was that there are benefits to helping people where they are. So rather than them having to come to us, we can literally zoom into their setting, their local lives, the challenges that they're facing in them day to day, and actually support them there. So we developed the Freedom Course as a way to really respond to the growing need. So we were seeing the trends that all the statistics point to, which is that mental health conditions were going off the chart. And as we all know, the NHS is struggling to keep up. And we kind of assume that these issues are secular issues, that maybe they don't impact the church as much, but all the statistics say the opposite, that actually it's as much a problem within the church. So we really wanted to make a way for us to be able to support people all over the country, regardless of age, regardless of gender.
And we'll come back to the sort of details, Paul, of the Freedom Force before the end of our chat. But, Bryn highlights it. You've highlighted it. Mercy is it's a faith-based Christian charity. It is looking to actually bring a message that is fundamentally built on biblical principles and biblical truth. And the issue of mental health and faith is a big one because, well, as we heard in that statistic at the beginning, 65% of those who are struggling say the church isn't really that supportive. How do we square that circle, Paul? How do we make that better?
I think one of the things is maybe to strip it back to the basics of our faith and to look that, we're made in the image of God, and we know that God is three and one. We know God as the Trinity. And if we're made in the image of God, we're also a tripartite being. We are a spirit, soul, and body. And I think when it comes to mental health, we often treat things, okay, we need to pray this away. Now, I'm all absolutely for prayer. And of course, on the Freedom course, we do a lot of praying and have times of ministry. But I think what would be helpful within churches and within Christianity is to actually look at the element that the body plays in that the brain as well, and our responses to stress and to anxiety and to loss and grief and things that go wrong, where often we're thinking that the only answer is a spiritual one, when actually part of it is for us in churches to understand that sometimes the talking element of things and teaching around what's happening to us in our body and our soul, and to see mental health not as a taboo subject, as you said right from the start, Paul. Everybody has mental health. I think Paul Benger, pastor of Icon Church, who spoke on the talkathon, coined a term a while ago, mental fitness. And that's the approach that they take in churches, to treat mental health as mental fitness, that we can all have varying degrees of mental wellness. And if we look at it from those terms, actually we can then start to incorporate as churches each of the elements of spirit, soul, and body, so that we're having a much more rounded approach to those conversations, so that we can actually help people understand that it is okay to talk about it. And for us to, like organizations like Mercy, for us to give training and input of our experience where we can to leaders of churches, because I think one of the things is it's not that the leaders in churches have poor intentions or beliefs around mental health. It's often that they just haven't been equipped to be able to input anything into it.
And do you think the language we use in church has an effect, Bryn? Because we do talk very much in terms of, trusting God and I suppose things like we pray to God to heal us, we pray to God to help us, but then, secretly we are harboring maybe frustration or even anger that we're in this place in the first place. And then we think in terms of the language that we're talking in church about trusting God, depending on him, him providing for us and so on. And if we're struggling with anxiety, it's really hard to admit that, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Paul, because I think that is part of the reality. And this can feel uncomfortable to say, because as Christians, we know that we're Christians and we go to church because there are fundamental truths there that we believe in. And we really the reason why we invite our friends to church is because we feel like if they could get hold of that purpose, that understanding of who they are in Christ and of what God has done for them and what that value base and that belief system offers them, it would transform their lives, which we obviously completely believe in. But I think we do have to acknowledge that what can happen sometimes is that you used a great example there of prayer. If we pray for healing because we've experienced some trauma in our life, we can pray for that, but often deep down, underneath all of that, is this actual real anger that God let it happen in the first place. but we don't always know what to do with that feeling. And so we bury it. And what often ends up happening then is that on top of every other thing that we're dealing with, on top of all our other mental health issues like anxiety or depression, there's this whole other layer of shame. And shame kind of acts as this extra blanket on top, that we feel ashamed that even though we're Christians and we know the ultimate healer, we're still struggling with this stuff. And we read verses like, do not be anxious about everything, but in prayer and petition, present it before the Lord. And so when we are then struggling with anxiety, our first thought is, what is wrong with me and what is wrong with my faith? Because I read in the Bible, there should be solutions out of this problem that I'm facing. And I think what we need to hang on to, and Paul mentioned it and did a great job earlier of explaining it, is that we need to understand as Christians and catch up with the thought processing in the philosophical psychological world around how the brain works. Because when you understand that, when you understand the neuroscience, you can really see that so much of how we are acting, how we are reacting to situations, it's hardwired into us. Like we can't control it. So actually what we need to do in terms of peeling back the layers of past experience, of what our belief system is, of where that belief system came from. And I don't just mean our belief in God. I mean our belief system that we're valuable, or whether what we think a man should be like, or how we should raise our kids, or how we should be a provider for our family. All of those belief systems have a root somewhere. They haven't come out of nothing. And often the work involved in peeling that back is quite hard, but it's absolutely vital that we just understand that there is multiple things going on. But I completely agree. I think the language can be tricky. I think also the tone, like I've often had periods of my life where I've really struggled with worship music, if I'm honest, because it carries a very specific tone. Like it's very much, God, I love you. I thank you so much that you love me. I give you all the praise. And these are all good things, and it's good to put ourselves in a position where we're speaking that over ourselves and we're trying to do that. But the reality is, so often we feel that to be able to sing that stuff, we have to really push down the stuff that we've struggled with during the week. And we don't always feel like there is space to bring that in a church environment. And I think also relates to why we as men struggle, because again, it's right, but so often when we go to church, the information we're hearing is being preached from a place of absolute certainty. This is what God says about this. This is what the Bible says about this. And understandably, there's very little space in there for uncertainty and for being unsure or being or struggle, because actually all we're ever hearing is absolute certainty. This is what God thinks. This is what God believes. And so it's really key that we find space within church environments to actually create space for uncertainty and ambiguity and just trying to figure out and muddle through life, because that can't be communicated from the stage. That needs to be done in group settings.
There's almost a sense, Paul, that we need to maybe be willing to be a little more vulnerable, a little more honest, some might say, about the realities. But people don't always want us to. I mean, as a church leader, when I struggled with emotional swings and anxiety after a period of trauma in our family's life, I mean, the church were very supportive while the traumatic events were going on. But when I actually told somebody in our church that I was going for counseling, her attitude was, but you're the pastor. You shouldn't need to do that, which was like, I knew that she loved me, but it wasn't incredibly helpful for me at that time in that journey. But there is a need, isn't there, for more of us to actually just go, hey, this is the reality. We all struggle with this sometimes, and be a little more open, a little bit more honest about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think vulnerability is such a powerful thing. If a leader in particular, for example, shows vulnerability, it's amazing how much will come out of a congregation, for example, of people then being able to say, gosh, I thought I was the only one going through that. And actually to going back to sort of what Bryn was saying there, of actually then not needing to present necessarily certain language or doing things in a certain way and having absolute certainty to say, actually, it's okay to not be okay, and that it's a journey. And if that vulnerability comes out, that's when you can actually truly be yourself. And when we get, there's one of the things we cover on the Freedom course is authenticity, and about being able to be vulnerable and to take our value and our worth from what God says about us and how he feels about us, so that we can then deal with the rejections and the difficulties and the criticisms of other people's opinions and lives. Like your example there of somebody saying, but you're the pastor. It's like, yes, and I'm a human pastor. I'm a human being who experienced a traumatic event, and the trauma is still living on at the moment, and I'm processing and I'm dealing with that because your brain is responding to trauma. Your emotions are responding to that trauma. And I often say this with participants on the course, that the price tag of authenticity is vulnerability. That's what it costs. And actually, vulnerability is one of the most liberating things to go through, because actually now I can present myself before God just as I am, just as he intended, and then he can work with me and explain to me that actually my behaviors are a result of my belief systems, which are a result of the root experiences that I've had. And he cares about those root experiences and the pain that we've had. God cares about the trauma that you went through and wants to bring healing in that, but also, as Bryn says, understanding what's going on in my brain, in my body, in your brain, in your body, in response to a traumatic event, and that it's actually okay for you to not have to be perfect and deal with this in a certain way.
And Bryn, I do think I mean, you mentioned right at the beginning, this sort of attitude within maybe a male perspective that we are the providers, we are the leaders, we are however we structure it. Whether it be I'm a leader in terms of my family are looking to me, whether it be I'm a leader in terms of my church or my workplace are looking for, wherever that sits within our societal image, even, within my group of mates down the pub, however that sits, there can be a fear that if I am open, if I make myself vulnerable, like Paul's saying, that actually the whole house of cards will fall down. And yet experience says if we are vulnerable to one another, honest with one another, trust one another to stand and walk alongside us, it actually makes stronger community. It does. It makes for stronger families, stronger churches, stronger workplaces, wherever. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the kind of slight paradoxes, is that we think we're doing what we should be doing because we feel like we need to present as strong, we need to present as having it all together. But as you said, the reality is the opposite, that actually what brings that sense of being able to lead and being able to be the role model we want to be is actually vulnerability. It's actually being able to model authenticity. But yeah, we all really struggle. We all really struggle to do it. And we had one of the guests that we had on the talkathon was a pastor from Australia who's got bipolar, and he was coming on to talk about his experience of being a pastor with bipolar and what the journey that he took to be really honest with his congregation about that. And one of the things that came out of that was that actually it's the ripple effect of what happens when we do that. And he gave an example of someone who had left the church that they had been going to because they felt like they couldn't be accepted because of the fact that they would struggle with the stimulation from church. So it's a very musical environment. The noise is quite loud, and they used to often have a reaction to that. But they were frequently told to be quiet and to kind of get to the back because they were being disruptive. And so they ended up leaving the church and actually staying out of church for a really long time. But what happens when we can model authenticity and vulnerability from the pulpit, from the front of church, is that it gives permission for people to be their authentic selves in the congregation and in the pews. So the ripple effects are huge. And actually, by us being able to do it and model it, we're giving permission to the people that we are there supporting to also do that. And it's life-saving. I mean, I've been thinking recently about the topic of pride, because often when you talk about men's mental health, one thing that will come up is that the real issue is pride, because as men we feel like we need to protect our sense of self, and pride does that. Pride is the the army that we send to guard ourselves, that we don't want to admit our faults and admit our wrongdoing because we're worried about how people will think about us, and we're worried about our standing and about our ego and about our reputation. And so pride stands guard protecting those things. But actually, when you look behind it and you say, what is pride actually protecting? Like, what is the self that I'm so keen to defend? Because actually, in each of us, and you gave your own personal example, Paul, in each of us, there are areas in our life where we know we're not living to our full potential. We know that we talk to our kids in a way we're not happy with. We know that we talk to our wives and our partners in a way that we're not happy with. We know that we are insecure or we're struggling with anxiety. And actually, God wants to break those things. And it can only happen when we ask pride to move to one side and we allow him into that soft center. And I think there can often be a bit of a misconception that this is part of our current age, that actually, that we live in an age where men are meant to be soft, and actually we talk about our feelings. But there are biblical principles in all of this that stem right back. And when you look at Jesus and who Jesus was and the space that he carved out for compassion, for empathy, he modeled that authentic vulnerability so well. And what he challenged in the people around him was often the inability to be compassionate. And he acknowledged that often came, like with the Pharisees, through an inability to soften their stance and to accept their own vulnerabilities and their own falling short. And he would challenge that, because when we can't do that, we lose the opportunity to be compassionate. We lose the opportunity to be gracious to those around us.
Yeah. It does take more than a small amount of courage, though, to step down that road of vulnerability, Paul, and to acknowledge that we need help, and then to actually find practical help that can make a difference, because there's an awful lot of stuff goes on around us, but to actually find something that can make a difference and to be able to access it in a meaningful way, it's not always easy to find the path. It's not always easy to see the way forward, which leads us into talking about your freedom course and the keys to the freedom book. And because it is very much about practical steps, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I think certainly from my perspective as a man, I find that quite helpful, again, without stereotyping. But certainly for me, I'm quite a pragmatic person, but I've learned over the years to be more in touch with my emotions and my feelings. But what I really love about the Keys to Freedom book and the Freedom course is that while it has a structure, it has a process. It's not so rigid that it's complicated and that you don't have time and space to deal with whatever you've actually got going on personally. But it's a course, certainly the Keys to Freedom book, something that everybody can do. It's very simple to read through. It's obviously biblically rooted, but it's broken down into relatively short sections. So the Keys to Freedom book is over 8 weeks. You can do it yourself. But when you are going through things, particularly mental health issues, the thought of doing a long, drawn-out course that's going to take hours and hours and hours in and of itself can be completely overwhelming. So what's great about the Keys to Freedom book is that it's simple and broken down into manageable sections that gives you plenty of time to be able to reflect, to pray. And there's lots of resource on the website as well to be able to look at. And you can add it into small groups or do it with a friend or a spouse. So it's very practical in the sense that it gives you tasks, asks questions, and works on the theme that everything in the book is an invitation to conversation with God. So it gently introduces you and where you're at, even if you're going through some mental health struggles and some hurts, introduces you into a conversation with the Lord to explore your relationship with him and what God's got to say about what it is that you're going through.
And when people come on the course, when people do the book, what is the impact that has? And we're thinking today particularly about men, but what is just that opening of that door, that giving of that opportunity? What does it bring to people when they are struggling with poor mental health, with anxiety, with fear, with all those sort of intimidating emotions that you described earlier. How does it bring a real, meaningful difference to them?
I think one of the first things is the general sense of relief that they can finally get some things off their chest and be able to, in a safe environment, particularly with the Freedom course, working with a facilitator where it's completely confidential and you are actually safe to be able to share and speak out some of the things that are going on for you, some of the things that maybe have never been shared with anybody before. So it's that relief that actually I can put this out there to God now and actually work through it. That's one of the main things. And also having the reassurance that you can bring some things and document them that maybe nobody else will read. So when you're doing the Keys to Freedom book, you can just do that between you and God and write things down and then close that book and put it away in a drawer. So it removes maybe the element of fear that many of us have about sharing these vulnerabilities and things, especially if it's things that we believe that we've done wrong or things that we're ashamed of. When you bring shame into the mix, which I would say is probably a large part of a lot of mental health issues, it's being able to bring those things out and then work right from the root causes of the hurt and the pain and be able to put those things to God and get answered to the questions that many of us then ask in church, for example. I guess it removes the element of stigma, being able to talk about things, knowing that nobody else knows about them and you're not going to be seen as stupid or sinful or rebellious. And then you've also got the practical elements within the book and having a Freedom course facilitator of being able to then work through which elements are to do with behaviors and belief systems and what's going on in the natural and what things maybe are needing to be explored in terms of faith and belief systems in the supernatural.
And when we look at this sort of stuff, Bryn, I noticed that neither you nor Paul are going, well, here are the list of things that you need to do. You start here, you do 1, 2, 3, 4, and then everything's fine. Because the reality of it is, it's a complex, but it's also a very individual journey, isn't it? To come to terms with the core beliefs that are shaping your perspective of yourself, to actually address maybe the physical habits of life that are contributing to that, and to start to move beyond it, whether we move beyond it in a faith perspective or whether we move beyond it simply in an emotional, psychological perspective. It's a complex journey. It's an individual journey. We have to take it on ourselves. We can't just be spoon-fed.
Yeah, it is complex, but I think that's part of the reason why so many of us just feel overwhelmed right at the very beginning. We know we need to do something about it, but we also know that it's going to be hard work and it's going to take us time, and we're going to have to address things that maybe we have never addressed. And the neuroscience of it is just absolutely fascinating. The fact that the way that our brains think and feel and process information and store memories, it's all impacted by our experiences. So those neurological pathways are literally formed in our childhood. So often the work involved is big and it is daunting, because we are going to have to think through and be curious why we think the way that we do. And we so often take it for granted that we just respond to certain situations. Whereas actually, when you go behind the scenes, you realize that there is a reason why we think like that. And actually to address that behavior, we're going to have to do the hard work of peeling back the layers. We use at the beginning of the Keys to Freedom workbook, and it's just a picture that we use throughout everything we do, the analogy of a tree. So the tree, the branches of the behavior, that's the stuff that people can see. So that's things like anger, anxiety, eating disorders. And often those are the things that we want to change. Those are the things that other people want to see changed in us. And we can just go ahead and lock that branch off. So we can go ahead and do things that will attempt to remove the anger, for example. We can go to anger management classes and remove that anger. But really, we're angry because that's coming from a belief system of how we think and perceive the world. And that belief system has its roots in something much, much deeper. It has roots into the circumstances that we've been brought up in. And all of those roots and those circumstances are completely individual. So yeah, it is very much a journey that we have to take on and be prepared to see through the long haul. But I think so often that is people's starting point. They know that they're struggling with stuff. They know they're not living life to full potential, and they are completely overwhelmed at what it's going to take to get to a different place. But that's where a process is helpful. And, I've also done counseling and found it beneficial. But one of the things I've also noticed about counseling is often in that environment, there is an expectation that you know what it is you're bringing into the counseling session. And that's when you'll get the most out of it. When you go in going, this is the thing I'm struggling with. Can you help me reframe it? CBT is great. Can you help me have a different thought pattern, a different thought process for this particular issue? But so often the reality is we don't actually know what is at the heart of the thing we're struggling with. We just know we're struggling. And that's where things need to happen hand in hand. So on the Freedom course, people have access to counseling, but they've also got a process that they go through. And I've been through Keys to Freedom, and what's so helpful about it is that having a process and going through those 8 weeks and going through those individual steps, what it does is that through the course of that time, you will examine and explore every cupboard that you haven't yet explored. So how is your relationship with your family? How is your relationship? What are the generational patterns that you're bringing forward that you're not even aware of? What's your attitude towards forgiveness? What are the areas in your life that there is unforgiveness? It is a detailed examination. And the another analogy we use that men will like this one. It's like an MOT. We want our motor to run smoothly, but we know to be, fuel efficient and to be safe on the road. Every year we have to go in, and we don't wait till a problem to arise. We go in and they check to make sure that any issue that could become a problem down the line is sorted there and then. They make sure we've got enough tread on our tires, that the oil is clean, that our wipers work properly so that we don't have an accident. And that's where a process like Keys to Freedom is just really helpful, because you can use it year on year. It's a regular check-in with yourself, just examine the different areas of my life and just making sure all is working well.
If you want to find out more details about the Freedom course or Keys to Freedom, well, you can find out all the details at mercyuk.org. That is the website, mercyuk.org. I know that when I started down the road of being willing to talk about the things I was struggling with, it was a scary time. It wasn't the actual trauma that was the problem, It was afterwards when things were resolved and life was starting to move forward. That's when I struggled to cope, and the guilt at not being able to cope, it was horrendous. But every time I walked into a session where I was willing to talk about how I felt and let the reality of what God wanted to say to me come out of it, even though I wasn't doing it with a Christian counselor, I was doing it with a non-Christian counselor. It was like every time God flicked on a switch and just brought revelation to my life. It doesn't always work like that for people. I recognize that. But for me, that was the starting point of understanding that talking about these things, exploring these things in a right place, being willing to be vulnerable about the reality that we all struggle with this sort of stuff. Our willingness to do that actually gives us the keys to freedom. It gives us the pathway to move forward. But more than that, in a world where so often people within church feel that they can't talk about their mental health, in a world where so many men struggle to actually address that, it gives us a pathway, an MOT that allows people to find their way forward as well. mercyuk.org is the website. Take a look at it for yourself. All the details are there. Bryn and Paul are from Mercy UK. Guys, thank you for what you do. Thank you for the work that you are facilitating for people. And thank you for taking time to join us and chat here today. Thank you very much.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Paul.
I'm Paul Hammond. Thank you as well to Rachel, my producer, for this week's program. And hey, why not join us next week for another one? Ta-da.